The dust had barely settled on the old stagecoach road when Sarah Mae Thornton caught sight of the rider approaching through the heat shimmer. Her heart stopped, then thundered like wild horses. Even from a distance, she knew that silhouette, the way he sat his horse, the tilt of his hat, the set of his shoulders that had haunted her dreams for 7 long years. Thomas Brennan had come home. Sarah's weathered hands gripped the porch railing of her small ranch house, knuckles white against the sun-bleached wood. The letter in her apron pocket seemed to burn against her hip, the letter she'd written 1,000 times but never sent. The one that held 7 years of longing, regret, and words that should have been spoken long ago. The rider drew closer, and there was no mistaking him now. Thomas Brennan, the man she'd loved since she was 16, the man she'd promised to marry before the war tore their world apart, the man she'd believed was dead until this very moment. He pulled his horse too. A stop at her gate, dust swirling around them both like the ghosts of their shared past. Neither spoke for a long moment. The years had changed him, carved lines around his eyes, silvered his temples, added a hardness to his jaw that hadn't been there when he'd ridden away in his blue uniform. But his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had once looked at her like she held the sun and moon in her hands, remained the same. "Sarah Mae," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered, like whiskey over gravel. "Thomas." Her own voice came out barely above a whisper. "I thought, ... we heard you died at Gettysburg." Shadow crossed his face. "Part of me did." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of 7 years. But Sarah's mind raced back to that terrible day when he'd left, when she'd stood on this very porch and watched him ride away to war. She'd worn her mother's white dress that day, had carried wildflowers picked fresh from the meadow behind the house. They were supposed to marry the following spring when he returned victorious and whole. But spring had come and gone, and then another and another. The letters had stopped coming after Gettysburg. And then word had reached Redemption Creek that Thomas Brennan's name was on the casualty lists. Sarah had mourned him, grieved for the life they'd never have, the children they'd never raise, the love that had been cut short by war and death. "May I?" Thomas gestured toward the gate. Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. She watched him dismount, his movements still graceful, despite the slight favor he gave his left leg. He tied his horse to the post and walked toward her, each step measured and careful as if he were approaching a wild animal that might bolt. "You look," he began, then stopped, shaking his head. "You look just as beautiful as the day I left." Sarah's hand went instinctively to her hair, now more silver than gold, to the lines that had appeared around her eyes, to the calluses that years of ranch work had carved into her palms. "I'm not the girl you left behind, Thomas. 7 years changes a person." "It does," he agreed, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm not the same man who rode away either." The weight of unasked questions hung between them. Where had he been all these years? Why hadn't he written? Why had he let her believe he was dead? But before Sarah could voice any of them, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Sheriff William Morrison rode up fast, his face grim and urgent. He pulled up short when he saw Thomas, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. "Sarah, you need to get inside," Morrison said, his eyes never leaving Thomas. "The Garrett gang is riding this way. Hit the bank in Silver Creek this morning, killed 2 men. Word is they're heading toward Redemption Creek." Sarah's blood ran cold. The Garrett gang was notorious throughout the territory. Ruthless outlaws who left nothing but death and destruction in their wake. Their leader, Jake Garrett, was said to be the most dangerous man west of the Mississippi. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. "Maybe an hour, if we're lucky," Morrison replied. He looked at Thomas again, suspicion clear in his eyes. "Don't believe. I know you, stranger." Thomas straightened, and for a moment, Sarah saw a flash of the young soldier he'd once been. "Thomas Brennan," he said simply. Morrison's eyes widened. "Brennan? But you're supposed to be dead?" "I know." Thomas's voice was flat. "It's a long story. You can tell it later if we all live through this," Morrison said. He turned back to Sarah. "I'm evacuating everyone to the church. It's the most defensible building in town, You need to come now. Sarah looked at her little ranch house, at the life she'd built with her own hands after losing everything else. I'm not leaving, Sarah. This is my home, Sheriff. I won't be run off by outlaws. Morrison looked like he wanted to argue, but time was running short. He glanced at Thomas. Can you handle a gun? I can, Thomas said quietly. Then I guess you'll do. Morrison wheeled his horse around. I'll send word if I can. Good luck. As the sheriff rode away, Sarah and Thomas were left alone again with the dust and the silence and the ghosts of their past. You don't have to stay, Sarah said. You don't owe me anything. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. I've been running for 7 years. Sarah May, I'm done running. The next hour passed in tense preparation. Thomas checked the rifle over the mantel, counted ammunition, tested the locks on the mat, doors and windows. Sarah packed food and water, gathered medical supplies, tried to keep her hands busy, while her mind raced with questions she didn't dare ask. Why? She finally said as they waited in the gathering dusk. Why did you let me think you were dead? Thomas. It was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with pain. Because I was ashamed, he said. Because when the war ended, I wasn't the same man who'd promised to come back to you. I'd done things. Sarah, terrible things. I'd become someone I didn't recognize, someone who didn't deserve the love of a good woman. That wasn't your choice to make, Sarah said, anger flaring in her chest. Should have let me decide what I could live with. I know that now. Thomas turned to look at her, and she saw the raw honesty in his eyes. But then, ... I thought I was protecting you. I thought you'd be better off without me. Better off? Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Thomas, I've spent 7 years grieving a ghost. 7 years wondering what I could have done differently. What I could have said to make you stay. 7 years alone. The word hung between them like a physical thing. Alone. But before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the evening air. They're here, Thomas said, moving to the window. Sarah joined him, peering through the curtains. In the fading light, she could see riders approaching, at least 6 of them, spread out in a line. Even from a distance, there was something menacing. About them, something that made her skin crawl, Sarah Thomas said, his voice urgent. There's something else I need to tell you. Something I should have said 7 years ago. Now Sarah asked, incredulous. Now you want to have this conversation? Might not get another chance? Thomas turned to face her fully, his hands reaching for hers. I love you, Sarah May Thornton. I've loved you since we were children, and I'll love you until the day I die. Everything I've done, every choice I've made, it's all been about trying to be worthy of that love. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Thomas, the sound of gunfire cut her off. The outlaws had reached the yard. Get down. Thomas pushed Sarah. Behind the heavy oak table, as bullets shattered the front windows, glass rained down around them, and Sarah could hear men shouting outside. Brennan! A voice called from the yard. We know you're in there. Come out and face us like a man. Sarah looked at Thomas in shock. They know you? Thomas's face had gone pale. It's Jay Garrett. We have ... history. What kind of history? Before Thomas could answer, Garrett's voice rang out again. You took something from me, Brennan. I'm here to collect what's owed. Why? Thomas closed his eyes, and Sarah saw the weight of whatever secret he carried settle on his shoulders like a stone. During the war, he said quietly, I was part of a special unit. We did things. ... Dark things. Garrett was in my unit. After Gettysburg, after we got separated from the main army, we turned to other means of survival. Sarah's blood ran cold. You were outlaws. For a time, until I couldn't stomach it anymore. Thomas met her eyes. Garrett wanted to rob a train carrying wounded soldiers. I couldn't let that happen. I turned on him, on all of them. I thought I'd killed him, but you didn't. No, and now he's here, for revenge. Another volley of gunfire peppered the house. Sarah could hear the men moving around outside, surrounding them. Brennan, Garrett called again. I'll give you one more chance. Come out, and I'll make it quick. Stay in there, and I'll burn the place down with both of you in it." Thomas looked at Sarah, and she saw the decision forming in his eyes. "No," she said firmly. "Don't even think about it. Sarah, if I go out there, you'll die, and they'll kill me anyway." Sarah grabbed the rifle from where Thomas had set it against the wall. "We fight together, or we don't fight at all." Thomas stared at her, and slowly a smile spread across his face, the first real smile she'd seen from him since he'd returned. "You always were the strongest person I knew," he said. "Then trust me now," Sarah replied. "Trust us." The next few minutes passed in a blur of violence and terror. The outlaws rushed the house from 3 sides, and Sarah and Thomas fought back with everything they had. Sarah had learned to shoot during the long, lonely years after the war, and her aim was true. Thomas fought with the skill of a trained soldier and the desperation of a man with everything to lose. But they were outnumbered. Ammunition was running low. "The back room," Thomas said during a brief lull in the fighting. "There's a root cellar. You can hide there until—" "I'm not hiding," Sarah said firmly. "We're in this together." Just then, they heard Garrett's voice, closer now, almost at the front door. "Time's up, Brennan. I'm coming in." The front door exploded inward, and Jake Garrett stepped through the wreckage. He was a tall man with cold eyes and silver hair, and he carried his guns like extensions of his own hands. Behind him came 2 of his men, their weapons trained on Sarah and Thomas. "Well, well," Garrett said, his voice smooth as silk. "The famous Thomas Brennan. You've led me on quite a chase, old friend." "Let her go, Jake," Thomas said, stepping protectively in front of Sarah. "This is between you and me." Garrett laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, but she's part of it now, isn't she? The love of the great Thomas Brennan. The woman who made him grow a conscience." "Please," Thomas said, and Sarah had never heard such desperation in his voice. "I'll do anything. Just let her go. Anything?" Garrett's eyes gleamed with malice. "Even die slowly." Thomas didn't hesitate. "Yes." Sarah's heart broke at the word. After 7 years of separation, of believing him dead, to lose him now to save her life, it was almost more than she could bear. But before Garrett could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the air. Many hoofbeats. What Garrett started, then cursed as rifle fire erupted from outside. His remaining men cried out, in alarm and then in pain. Sheriff Morrison's voice rang out clear and strong. "This is the law. Surrender now." The next few moments were chaos. Garrett spun toward the window, trying to see what was happening outside, and Thomas took the opportunity to tackle him. They went down hard, rolling across the floor as they fought for Garrett's gun. Sarah grabbed her rifle and moved toward the broken door. One of Garrett's men was trying to get a clear shot at Thomas. She pulled the trigger, and the man went down. Outside, the battle was fierce but brief. The sheriff had brought a posse of 20 men. The remaining members of the Garrett gang were quickly overwhelmed. Inside the house, Thomas and Garrett continued their desperate struggle. They were evenly matched, and both fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. Finally, Thomas managed to pin Garrett to the floor, but Garrett still had his gun. "You always were too soft, Brennan," Garrett snarled, raising the weapon. Sarah didn't hesitate. The rifle bucked in her hands, and Jake Garrett's eyes went wide with surprise before the light left them forever. Thomas rolled away from the dead man, breathing hard. For a moment, the house was silent, except for the sound of their ragged breathing and the distant voices of the sheriff's posse outside. "It's over," Thomas said, his voice filled with wonder. "It's finally over. Da-da-da." Sarah set down the rifle with trembling hands and sank to her knees beside him. The weight of everything, the fear, the violence. The 7 years of separation hit her all at once. She began to cry. Thomas pulled her into his arms, and she could feel his own tears on her hair. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. Sarah May. For everything. For leaving. For staying away. For bringing this danger to your door." "You came back," Sarah said against his chest. "That's all that matters. You came back." They held each other as Sheriff Morrison and his men secured the scene. The bodies were carried away, and the broken glass was swept up. They held each other as the sun set over the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. When the sheriff finally approached them, his face was kind but serious. "It's over," he told them. "The Garrett gang is finished. But Thomas, there's still the matter of your past activities." Thomas tensed, but Sarah squeezed his hand. "What do you need to know, Sheriff?" Thomas asked. "The truth," Morrison said. Simply so, Thomas told him. He told him about the war, about the things he'd done to survive, about the moment he'd chosen to turn away from that life. He told him about the years he'd spent wandering, trying to make amends, helping people, when he could, always running from his past. Morrison listened without judgment, occasionally asking a question for clarification. When Thomas finished, the sheriff was quiet for a long time. "The way I see it," Morrison finally said, "you've already paid for your crimes. What you did tonight, protecting the town, protecting Sarah, ... That speaks to who you are now, not who you were then." Thomas looked stunned. "You mean ... mean you're free to start over if that's what you want?" Morrison tipped his hat to Sarah. "Ma'am, you've got yourself a good man here, one who's learned the value of doing right." After the sheriff left, Sarah and Thomas sat on the porch in the gathering darkness. The stars were coming out, bright and clear in the desert sky. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking out at the vast expanse, a prairie that stretched to the horizon. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've been running for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place." Sarah took his hand in hers, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his hard years. "Then learn," she said. "We'll learn together." Thomas turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw the man she'd fallen in love with all those years ago. They're now scarred by experience, but still the same man who had promised to love her forever. "Will you have me?" he asked. "After everything I've done, everything I've put you through." Sarah smiled, and it felt like the sun coming up after the longest night of her life. "Thomas Brennan," she said, "I've been waiting for you for 7 years. I'm not about to stop now." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. Sarah felt something that had been broken inside her finally begin to heal. 3 months later, the wedding was small, just Sheriff Morrison to officiate, a few neighbors as witnesses, and the endless blue sky as their cathedral. Sarah wore her mother's dress, the same one she'd worn 7 years ago, carefully mended and altered to fit the woman she'd become. Thomas wore a simple black suit, his hair freshly cut, his face clean-shaven. He looked nervous as he waited at the makeshift altar they'd set up in Sarah's front yard. But when she appeared in the doorway, his face lit up with such joy that several of the witnesses had to wipe their eyes. "Dearly beloved Sheriff," Morrison began, but Sarah barely heard the words. She was lost in Thomas's eyes, in the miracle of this moment that she'd dreamed of but never dared hope for. When it came time for the vows, Thomas spoke first, his voice clear and strong. "Sarah May Thornton," he said, "I can't promise you an easy life. I can't promise that my past won't cast shadows on our future. But I can promise you this. I will love you with everything I have for all the days of my life. I will stand beside you through whatever comes, and I will never, ever leave you again." Sarah's voice shook as she spoke her own vows, but her words rang true. "Thomas Brennan, you are my heart, my home, my hope for tomorrow. I choose you, not in spite of your past, but because of it. Because it made you the man standing before me now, man worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth loving for the rest of my life." When Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Sarah with 7 years of longing and love, and the small crowd cheered. But Sarah barely heard them. In that moment, there was only Thomas, only love, only the promise of all the tomorrows they would share. 1 year later, Sarah stood on the same porch where she'd first seen Thomas's return. The house had been rebuilt and expanded. The ranch was thriving. And in her arms she held their 3-month-old son. It's a perfect blend of both his parents. Thomas rode up from the south pasture, his face sun-weathered but content. He dismounted and climbed the porch steps, kissing Sarah softly before taking the baby in his arms. "How are my two favorite people?" he asked, his voice warm with happiness. "Happy," Sarah said simply, and it was true. After so many years of longing and loss, she had finally found her way home. Thomas looked out at the land they'd built together, at the life they'd carved from the harsh beauty of the frontier. Sometimes, late at night, Sarah would catch him staring out at the horizon with a faraway look in his eyes. She knew he was thinking about the past, about the choices he'd made and the roads he'd traveled. But then he would turn to her, and she would see the peace in his face, the contentment of a man who had finally stopped running. No regrets? She asked him now, as she had many times before. Thomas smiled. It's the same smile that had captured her heart when they were young and kissed her forehead. "Only one," he said, "but that it took me so long to find my way back to you." The sun was setting. Over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, a wild and lonely sound that spoke of the untamed heart of the frontier. But here on this porch, with her husband's arms around her and their child sleeping peacefully between them, Sarah felt nothing but joy. They had found their way through the darkness, through separation and sorrow, and the harsh realities of a hard land.